I stepped off the gravel tongue and onto the salars while the sun was still low enough to be kind. The crust looked like a broken dinner plate laid to every horizon, a jigsaw of salt panes with seams breathed open by old heat. I pulled the hat low against the first flare of glare and checked the simple things the way the office taught me to check them. Brim tied, water snug against the back, core tube lashed, compass zeroed by habit more than need, receiver awake and patient in my palm. The Atacama does not rush. If you hurry, it watches until you make a mistake. Last month's work order was to cross the white and verify a line someone had drawn from a desk, a slender corridor of safe crust meant to carry survey loads to an island of rock. My task was not to argue with the line, only to see whether the ground would accept it. I built a routine like a shelter. Step, listen, step. Scan for bruised patches where crust thins to treachery. Walk the polygons with your weight centered as if on a slack rope. Pause for a breath when the light flares off a shallow brine window. Every so often, kneel and press a finger to the skin of the salar and feel its temperature, not to measure it, but to learn the day's temperament. The salt will tell you if it wants to be walked on. When the sun climbed, the air sharpened and lost its smell altogether. In places like this, the first scent you register is often your own kit warming. Canvas, webbing, a touch of plastic, never the land itself. I told myself to keep an ear for small sounds. In empty places, small sounds matter. The receiver gave me the first waypoint as a tiny promise. I watched the horizon for the basalt plug that should rise ahead with distance, a dark tooth in a sea of white, and I watched the instrument's patient dot with the same mild faith you grant a metronome. The compass needle sat calm at my knee when I stooped to retape a strap. I logged the air in my own head the way I always do. No wind, a shimmer low to the ground, distant heat quivers above the darker belts. Then I walked. The first hour of a salar crossing is where you trade world noise for field noise. The hiss of breath through a dust mask. The faint squeak where the core tube rides its lashings. The quiet sand tick when a polygon edge flakes. I set the second promise where the line on the office map wanted it. I used a small flag pressed into a salt seam, so the wind, if it woke, would not take it. The receiver pinged and wrote its little line, and I wrote my own line in the notebook. Flag in seam, crust thickness by heel test firm, surface tone bright, no fluid bloom. I do not write numbers in that book unless the work demands it. Instead, I write behaviors. If crust resists, I say it resists like old cheese. If it yields, I say it gives like a soaked cracker. A desert does not remember digits. It remembers pressure and patience. The first wrong thing arrived quietly. The dot marking my path eased sideways in a way that did not match my boots. The instrument told me I was drifting even as the compass needle waited like a heron and the basalt tooth bore steady ahead. I have seen receiver wander in canyons where signals scatter, in storms where the sky turns to metal. Here the sky was clear as bleached bone, and the horizon was clean in all directions. I walked a slow circle to tease the issue and watched the log paint an oval broader than my boots by a distance my body did not feel. The error could have been the satellites stretching their geometry. A desert navigator learns not to spook at an instrument's first sigh. Still, I felt the familiar pinch in the ribs that means the day will not be simple. I set down the core tube and took a shallow plug from a safe seam, turning by hand so I could feel the difference between hard crust and the damp layer that means stop. The tube came up with a sound like thin cork from a narrow bottle. The brine hazed in the bore and then disappeared, drawn down or off into salt veins I could not see. On the inside of the tube, a pale film clung and took the shape of the light. When I capped it, I noticed a smell that did not belong out here. Not rotten or sweet, not mineral. Paper warmed on a copy machine. It rode up in the nose for a breath and then was gone, as if the wind had handed me a joke and taken it back. I checked the compass again and set its edge along the line to the rock. The receiver's track had eased farther to the south of where my feet had been. I took a few pace steps north to correct and felt the crust turn whispery under the tread, so I returned to my original bearing, marked by the shadow of my hat brim on the next seam. The wrongness did not sharpen. It held like a low note. I took out the radio and breathed it live. The office voice came through faint and even. I gave them the situation in clean talk. Receiver wander, compass calm, visual bearing stable, crust good, taking cores per interval. The reply came with a pause that I have learned to respect. Copy, continue, note any pattern. A paper answer from a room with curtains. I wanted to ask whether any test signals had been pushed to the sky lately, but the channel felt brittle, so I signed off and put the radio away. The sailor does not like chatter. When the heat rose, the ground began to sing. Not loud, more like the pulsing scratch of a fingertip across a glass rim. Some salt fields do this as they warm. Trapped films of water adjust and release, and the plates voice what the day does to them. I told myself that was all it was. Yet, as I walked, I heard the tone slide a hair lower when the receiver said I was high, and a hair higher when it said I sagged, as if the sound were tracking not my body, but the idea of my body according to the instrument. I tried to ignore the notion. You can hear patterns in white noise if you want to, especially when you are alone in a long frequency of light. Routine is armor, so I put it back on. I sipped water, I recorded another plug. I lifted the brim to scan the far edge and caught the smallest shiver in the air above the basalt target, as if something there had learned to shimmer against being named. On the notebook, I wrote a phrase my mentor taught me for days like this: hold two truths and keep walking. The first truth, my eyes and compass agreed. The second, my receiver wanted me elsewhere. The cost of choosing wrong out here is not theatrical. It is simply that you tire faster, and you waste water, and your options narrow while the sun learns your habits. I adjusted my shadow instead of my feet. I aligned the receiver's insistence with the angle of my body to the sun and pretended that I was following both. It was a trick for morale, not for navigation. The singing underfoot steadied and then fluttered. At one seam I crossed, the sound seemed to stop a fraction after my boot left the pane, late by a heartbeat. Not quite echo, not quite lag. I tested it again, stepping back and forth, and the same delay visited like a hiccup in a looped tape. I told myself it was my imagination, and then I wrote it down anyway. A navigator does not marry pride. At midday, the light tightened, and the salar became what it really is: a place that likes to be its own map. Features flatten, your sense of distance loosens, and then comes back on a different leash. The basalt tooth that had looked near enough to rest a hand on now lived beyond a length of glare that made my eyes water. The compass needle flicked a fraction and stopped, a tiny shiver that could have been my hand taut on the case. The receiver dot took another sidestep, as if to walk around a person who did not exist. I was tempted to walk the way the instrument wanted, so that if I was wrong, I would be wrong with something that beeps, and that kind of wrong can be defended to an office. Instead, I stuck with the line my body believed. If I was going to err, I wanted to err on something I could feel. I gave the radio a brief note for the log. Field report. Minor instrument drift, sensory check steady, underfoot tone variable with track line, no fluid bloom or crust failure, continuing per plan. The carrier hisses breathed a little pattern that made me think of keys tapped lightly in another room. I let it pass through and clicked off. The smell of warm paper came back only once, there and gone, as if the desert had adopted a trick to keep my attention. By late light, the edges of the polygons began to throw thin shadows, a relief map for the boot sole. My body loosened its shoulders because the land at last gave me depth. I took one more shallow core and set a final flag in a seam that felt like a seam ought to feel. The receiver sketched a path that now lived a little to my right, like a companion who will not walk beside you, only near. The compass pointed past its own reflection in the glass and landed where my eyes wanted to be. The ground sang a longer tone and then fell quiet, as if something had lost interest or taken notes and moved on. I wrote one last line in the book before stowing it. Basalt tooth holds steady. Instrument trails like a shadow reluctant to admit it belongs to me. Water good, body good, mind a little sharp from watching. Orders say cross and confirm. I will cross and confirm. Tomorrow I will cut the line at an angle and see whether the drift turns with me or keeps its own road. If the sky is honest, I will carry the stars as a third witness. For now, I will trust the old tools, the needle, the brim, the slow breath that keeps pace with a world that does not promise anything. Yesterday I stepped onto the salar with a routine like a shelter, and the ground accepted it. The receiver gave tidy dots while the compass and my eyes agreed on the black tooth ahead, but then the dots began to wander as if embarrassed to walk beside me. The crust sang in a faint glass tone that seemed to slip a breath behind my steps, and a smell like warm paper visited once and vanished. I logged cores, sent a calm radio note, and chose to trust the needle and the brim over the beeps. I camped on the rock island with my back to a low wall and promised myself I would cut across my own track at first light and ask the drift to choose a side. At dawn, the salar was a blank ledger, and my footprints rode across it in a gray lace. I left the island just as the wind tried and failed to wake, tipping my hat to keep the first glare off the eyes. I began with a simple test. Walk at a shallow angle to yesterday's line and watch who obeys, the receiver, the compass, or the body's quiet map. The crust was cool and tight, each pane speaking when I found its seam with the boot, a click that lived somewhere between bone and glass. I gave myself a gentle pace. A desert punishes any attempt to bully it into answers. The receiver fell into step as if we had forgiven each other. It drew a neat path that paralleled yesterday's track at the distance I had planned, and for a while my chest loosened. Then the line eased toward me without the feet asking it to. I stopped and made a slow pivot in place, scanning the far dark tooth, noting its mild fattening in the haze. The compass needle stayed loyal. I walked on, and the line drew closer again as if pulled by my shadow, snugging toward yesterday's boot marks as though they had become a current. When I finally reached those prints, I knelt and felt the crust around them. It was firm where it should have been tired. The edges were fresher than they had any right to be, as if they had not spent a night breathing under stars. I pressed a finger into the mark of my heel, and the salt resisted. I wrote in the notebook, "Tracks show no slack overnight, edges deny time." I moved along the old prints while keeping the new line at a respectful remove. At intervals, I set the core tube into seams that spoke cleanly and brought up skins of salt that told a plain story. Damp thin below, dry above, sound enough for load. While I worked, the salar's song returned, the same rim scratch it had sung yesterday, yet it behaved like a listener. When I drifted toward the receiver's confidence, the tone went a half shade brighter, and when I leaned back toward the compass and the eye line, it dropped to a low, patient hum. I made myself treat this as coincidence. A field mind will make a choir out of wind if you let it. By mid-morning, I found the first refusal. My boot prints from yesterday, which should have continued north of my body like a stitched hem, simply stopped. Not faded, not blown by a wandering gust. Stopped at a clean seam as if they had decided that line did not deserve crossing. Beyond the seam, the salt carried a scatter of ordinary scuffs, the faint starburst marks where crystals fail under a heel, but none of them belonged to me. I set my water down and took the time to breathe, the way you do before you cut into a knot. Then I stepped over the seam and followed the absent path across its absence. 10 paces later, I turned back and saw my fresh prints leading to the seam and through it. Behind the seam, the older prints remained politely non-existent, a paragraph missing from a page. I radioed the office and kept it clean. Field to base, track discontinuity observed at seam, prior prints do not continue beyond, receiver shows continuous line, compass bearing steady, crust sound. The answer came back with the careful calm of people who have not yet decided whether to believe me. Copy discontinuity. Suggest photograph and continue. Check for wind scour. Confirm receiver firmware. I took a few frames for their comfort and for my own inventory, though a camera never convinces me as much as a finger dragged along a surface. I did the drag and felt a slight powder where a print should have been. Not absence, exactly. More like a sentence rubbed away and then rewritten in nearly the same words. The smell found me again while I worked. That warmed paper note you get when a copier exhale closes a room. It rose and fell with the radio hiss, a ghost of office air that made my mouth dry. I shook it off and put my attention back into the ground. The next set of boot marks was honest again. I followed them to a flag I had set and found it tucked where I had left it, seam-bound and upright, a little crust rim forming around its base. The receiver drew its line right across it and then leaned left as I turned right, as if it had lost interest in the flag's authority. I set myself another test. Walk a small rectangle, log it, and see whether the instrument remembers the corners the way my legs do. On the first side, I counted breaths and felt the muscles work in a rhythm that I have trusted across many flats. At the corner, I placed a tiny shard of basalt for my own reference and pivoted, keeping my shoulders square and my eyes low. On the second side, the crust thinned to a whisper. The sound underfoot shifted from glass to damp paper. I backed off a half step each time the whisper tried to take my weight. At the third side, the singing returned and stood up taller. At the fourth, I closed upon my shard and stopped. The receiver had drawn something close to a shape, but not the shape I walked. The first and third legs bowed toward one another, as if a hand had pressed on the page while the ink was wet. I wrote in the book, rectangle prefers cushion. I touched the shard and felt it warm from my own hand, then slid it into a pocket to keep it from becoming someone else's witness. While I stood there, the air performed a small wrongness. The haze seemed to ripple from the basalt island toward me in a slow catch-up. Not like heat shimmer, even shimmer keeps faith with the world it distorts, but like a mirage learning a new trick. The black tooth swam and then returned sharper than before, as if embarrassed by its own play. The compass gave a modest flinch and held. The radio in my pack tapped without speaking, a tiny relay twitch that made me think of a person changing their mind. I let the oddness sit and turned to the practical cost. Water rides high at morning and lower after any patience test. I sipped and weighed whether to press farther from the rock or arc back, and reconfirm the corridor plotted by a desk. Orders were simple: cross and verify. Field reality made a counteroffer. Spend a day learning how the salar thinks about lines. I chose the second, because in my trade you can obey a map and still fail the ground. The choice would cost fluid and time. I paid both. I set a diagonal track that would bring me toward a soft patch I had marked the day before with my eyes, not with a flag. The receiver scolded, wanting me to soften the angle. The compass was happier, its needle lying along a comfortable thought. As I walked, I noticed a second refusal. A line of tiny fissures that should have been straight simply decided to curve around me like the wake behind a boat, a relaxed bend following my hip. I stopped, and the bend slowed. I walked, and the bend finished its arc a breath late, then calmed. I told the notebook. Seam lag echoes movement, not wind, not insect. I stood still and watched the crust pretend nothing had ever moved. A rare breeze made a pass, dry as flour, and lifted my hat brim just enough that light scraped across the salt and showed textures usually hidden. In that light, I saw another set of prints not my own, older than mine, different tread, coming from no direction that made sense. They walked a short length beside my path and then dissolved without convincing reason. The sizing said a person near my weight. The spacing said patience. The edges, though, had the same refusal to admit a night had passed. I set the core tube near one of those prints and turned it gently. The plug came up with a layered story. A thin dampness, a firm cap, a smear of brine that slid like oil and then blinked dry. I pressed the tube to my cheek and felt a cool that did not match the air. The paper smell arrived again with more insistence, and under it, a hint of something metallic, like a battery unwrapped in sun. I spoke to the radio in a voice that kept the horizon out of it. Field to base, additional tracks present, inconsistent aging, seam behavior shows lag, instrument sketching curves against walked rectangles. Request permission to hold corridor verification and conduct drift pattern study. The reply took longer than comfort. When it came, the words were shaped by people leaning toward their screens. Permission granted for limited study. Maintain safety margins. Report hourly. The salar listened to those margins and did not comment. As day leaned toward its hard white center, the ground began to speak less, and the sky did the speaking instead. The light made a steady pressure on the eyes that forced more blinks than usual. I cut one more diagonal and found myself at the edge of a field of plates darker than the rest. A stretch where heat had cured the crust into something like kiln work. My boots set off a different song there, a note that lived inside the soul and came up through the bone. I stood in that darkened patch, and the receiver suddenly behaved as if flattered, drawing its cleanest line yet. The compass needle, though, leaned toward a direction that would walk me back across my earlier rectangle, at a bias I did not enjoy. For a long minute, I let both voices speak, and then chose the dead weight of the needle. It is not romantic, it is simply ancient. I ended the day farther from the island than planned, at a low swell of salt that made a dry pillow of my pack. I wrote hard by fading light. Sky honest, receiver flirts, needle stubborn. Tracks that are not mine suggest company without destination. Seams learn to bend and then pretend not to. Paper smell rides the radio. Singing follows the map in the instrument more than the map in the body. I set the last line with a promise. At night, I will take bearings on stars and ask them whether the salar listens. If those points agree with my eye, I will walk by them and let the receiver sit in the pocket like a sulking child. If they do not, I will learn how to move with a map that moves. Either way, the corridor on the office sheet will answer to the ground, not the other way around. The wind finally woke after sundown and dragged a dry tongue across the crust. The volt of cold that always comes on a clear desert night settled in. I lay with the hat pulled low and listened for the rim scratch and heard nothing. Instead, there was a distant patterned tap that sounded like keys in another room, steady and patient and not my own. I told myself it was the little relay in the radio settling with the temperature. I told myself not to tell stories. Then I slept and dreamed of a ledger that erased the lines I drew as fast as I drew them, leaving only the salt itself, which needed no pen to remember. Night gave me what I asked for, and then took something back. When the stars rose, the basalt tooth sat under them like a measured thumbprint, and the old points made their clean geometry across the sky. I set the compass on a flat shard and let its needles settle, then took bearings with the hat brim pulled up, naming the brighter witnesses the way I learned to name kin on bad roads. The lines those stars made agreed with my eye, and the needle purred along the same thought. The receiver lay in my pocket, turned down to a dim patience, yet even there it fussed. I could feel the faint haptic pride in it whenever a satellite tightened its angle. I marked a quiet path across the ledger with my body, trusting the sky and the iron more than the beeps. The salt answered not with the rim scratch of day, but with a dry whisper, like paper rubbed together softly by someone who did not want to be noticed. I walked the length I needed, knelt, and pressed my palm flat to the crust. The cool came up clean. For a breath, I believed the sky had settled the argument, and then the whisper shifted under my hand, late by the space between a word spoken and a word heard back. I slept on the rock with that small delay in my head, and the radio ticking the way relays tick when cold stiffens their minds. Dawn flattened all mercy and made of the salar a clean sheet again. I rose early enough that the light had not yet hardened, drank with care, and repacked the core tube and the receiver, as if they were two stubborn acquaintances who would be attending the same meeting. My plan was a map of questions. Cross the previous rectangle at a new slant, walk by the stars where the sky was still visible, and ask the ground whether the song belonged to signal or crust or me. The air held no scent at first. As the sun touched the first seams, the mild sweetness of heating webbing formed a ghost around me and then slipped away. I started with a short leg toward a field of darker plates because that kiln-cured patch had tamed the receiver once. The compass rode my thumb and settled like a sparrow. The receiver pretended to be humble for the first stretch, drawing along with dignity while my boots kept to a cadence the body knows without thinking. Then it leaned off, not with the sudden swerve of a glitch, but with the small persuasion of a friend trying to steer you toward a favorite cafe. I denied it and kept my line. The song underfoot returned, a low glass note that climbs when pains warm and drops when they give back to air. I listened as if a metronome had been hidden in the ground. The odd thing was not the pitch, but who it obeyed. When I edged my shoulders to give the receiver a fraction of its wish, the note brightened a hair. When I brought my shoulders back to the iron and the star thought, the note sank to its patient hum. I made myself walk a leg without changing anything, then another at the same length, and another again, naming out loud the smells and sounds and textures, not to conjure them, but to anchor them where they belonged. The notebook took my lines without complaint. It does not care whether it remembers a desert or a kitchen. It will hold whatever words you give it and make the same assurances. On the second leg, I cut straight across my old prints and saw them try to decide whether they would allow being crossed. The freshest of yesterday's marks showed a scuff where the boot had rolled, and that scuff wore the right age, the right crumbling at its edge. But the deeper heel marks were too tidy, as if a careful hand had come along in darkness and neatened them. New prints and old stood side by side without the honest difference time should lay between them. I pressed a thumb into one of the older heels and felt firm resistance, as though the crust had rehearsed being strong. I wrote it down plain. Time does not chew here as fast as it should. I took a core alongside the odd pair of marks. The plug came up with the faintest film of brine that clung to the tube, like glass gone soft, and when I brought the tube to the nose, the warmed paper smell rose surely enough to make the throat tighten. That scent belonged to offices and copiers and the air above a stack of freshly printed routes. It did not belong in a field of salt under a sky that had never learned that smell. It passed and left a bare metallic ghost behind, as if a small battery wished to be noticed. The radio crackled awake of its own accord, a bored click more than speech. I brought it to my mouth and kept the words clean. Field to base, star bearings align with compass. Receiver drift persists with small persuasion toward non-walked line. Salt tone tracks that persuasion. Experiencing scent anomaly consistent with warmed paper. Transient metallic hint. Core shows thin brine film above firm cap. Requesting guidance on whether to trust sky over instrument for corridor verification. The answer arrived slower than comfort, and when it came, it had the shape of a memo bleached into a voice. Copy alignment with celestial and magnetic. Authorized judgment call in favor of sky if safety and crust permit. Continue sampling. Monitor for repeat of odor. Advise if audible events change. I thanked them and stowed the radio. The relay ticked twice after I closed the channel. 2 mild taps, as if someone had drummed their fingers near the microphone and then remembered themselves. In the middle of the morning, the wind tried again and gave up. Heat got to its chair and sat. The black tooth swam in that way horizons do on a salt sea, then snapped back into definition as if embarrassed. I reached the kiln patch where plates had cooked darker and stepped onto it with care. The tone under my feet deepened and steadied, and the receiver, true to yesterday's behavior, regained its dignity, its line riding pleasantly close to my walked path. This would have been a comfort if the compass had not leaned a touch away, the kind of lean you feel rather than see, a suggestion more than a command. I stopped and measured everything against breath. When in doubt, I told myself, keep a constant heart and listen to what changes while your own meter holds. The salt sang the same deep note. The receiver traced the walk earnestly. The compass held to its mild objection. And then I felt it. The kiln patch itself had a tug in it, not magnetic, more like a groove worn in an old floor by the same steps over and over. I moved a pace sideways and the tug eased. I moved back and it returned, a slight tendency in the body to give weight where the ground expected weight to go. I tested the patch with a small triangle walk, the simplest geometry I had. Step off, pivot, step, close. My legs closed the shape easily. The receiver drew a shape that shared corners with mine but refused one side. It curved where I had walked straight, as if the instrument had been asked to accommodate a rule of the sailor that my knees did not get to learn. I spoke the results softly, for my own record. The radio was quiet, though the relay made a sound like a key tapped once in a far room. I kept my hands away from the talk switch and waited. A breath later, the warmed paper scent came again. Little more than a memory stroked under the nose. I closed my eyes and let it pass. When I opened them, the dark plates of the kiln patch were different only by the light they wore. I walked away and the tug went with the patch, not with me. Costs always declare themselves around midday. Water left the bladder more quickly than the morning had promised. The brim felt heavier because the mind behind it was busy. The salt reflected more of the sky than it had any right to. I shifted my plan to conserve the body. Cut back toward the island, I told myself, but take the long curve, and along that curve build a ladder of small trials to see whether the drift and the song obey distance, exposure, or some unseen structure in the crust. I made a series of deliberate errors that did not look like errors to anyone watching. I let the receiver win for a breath and then took the wind back. I stopped with one boot on a seam and one on a pane, and counted breaths until the song resolved to a single pitch. I stepped onto a pale flow within the white and waited for it to either argue or accept me. The song did not change its mind quickly. That was the rule I wrote for the noon hour. And yet, when the radio ticked again without speaking, the pitch shifted a hair toward the receiver's preference, as if acknowledging a supervisor. The last breadcrumb of the day slid in without show. I reached a run of seams that had spent a long time pretending to be straight. They were straight enough to please a surveyor, and yet they had picked up a habit. When I walked beside them, the faint dark line inside each seam traveled with me a fraction late, as if ink under glass trusted my direction more than the grounds. I stopped, and the line stopped after, like obedient dogs that only now remembered to sit. I told the notebook the truth as I saw it. The salar listens and then repeats, not echo, not mirage, a delay that chooses company. I made camp short of the island, a tidy shoulder of salt giving me a windbreak that did not yet deserve the name. The basalt tooth hung in the near distance larger than it had any right to be. The day's long stare had pulled it forward in the mind. I wrote the ledger's evening entry with a few extra breaths between thoughts. Stars favor the needle, receiver favors a map that bends hugged by newly curious seams. Salt song rises when I humor the beeps and settles when I trust the sky. Paper smell tied to radio moments, appears and withdraws without wind. Tracks resist aging, yesterday colonizes today. Soft tug and kiln patch suggests grooves not made by us. I added the line I had been avoiding because adding it makes it real. The waypoints in the receiver did not slide back to where they had been when the sky held them to account. They adjusted politely and then waited where the instrument wished them to live, as if a desk far away had drawn them again in a slightly different place, and the beeps were simply keeping faith with their new names. Dark came without ceremony. The wind returned like a clerk late to their shift and made a few notes. I clipped the receiver to the inside of the tent and let it see enough sky to be happy, then lay on my back with the compass resting on my chest and the hat over my eyes. Somewhere in the radio, a relay eased with the cold and tapped twice, that same light rhythm of keys in a quiet hallway. Beneath me, the crust said nothing. The singing had retreated to whatever room salts speak in when the heat goes. I breathed the steady breath I had promised to keep steady and told myself that in the morning I would walk to a waypoint with the stars, then look down and see whether the instrument had agreed to meet me there or had elected to host me somewhere else. If it chose elsewhere, I would follow for a short while and ask it to show me who it was trying to please. Before dawn, I let the receiver sit clipped to the tent's ridge where it could see enough of the sky to do its secret math. I lay beneath it, listening to the dry creak, as fabric cooled and the tiny taps from the radio that arrive when metals change their minds in the night. The cold, thin thought to something usefully simple. Walk to a name point by the stars and the needle, then ask the instrument whether we met. If it insisted we had not, follow it a short way and find out who it was honoring. The wind gave a brief clerk's sigh and went elsewhere. When the first pail came up, I unhooked the receiver and checked the screen the way you check a note left under your door. The waypoints had moved by a distance that a desk would call small, yet it was large enough for boot soles to notice. They had not wandered as dots do when geometry loosens. They had been placed. Each now lived a little west and a touch south of where I had left them yesterday, as if someone with a careful hand had nudged pins on a board and then written a new caption. I drank, shouldered the tube, and the water, and the quiet anger that comes when a tool begins to choose its own friends, and stepped out. The sky still held the brighter witnesses. I used them the way a sailor uses familiar lamps. The compass rode gentle in my palm and answered the same names. I walked a straight, slow line toward a point that yesterday had worn the name of a corner. The crust at this hour was a truthful floor. It held my weight without negotiation, and the seams gave only the softest murmurs when the boot crossed them. I reached the place that the old sky and the old iron agreed upon, and stopped with the brim up and the breath quiet. Under my feet, the salt felt cool through the sole. I marked the spot by habit with a thumb-sized shard from my pocket, and set the receiver's crosshair over the world it now believed to be that point. The instrument said I was not yet there. It put my body a little to the east like an apology. Its tiny arrow wanted me to step toward the kiln patch that had tugged me yesterday. The yearning lived in the wrist as a hint of pressure to turn. I looked at the black tooth on the horizon, found it where it should be, and let the urge die. In the notebook I wrote with more care than usual. Waypoints redrawn in the night, instrument invites a bias. Sky and iron refuse the invitation. I decided to let the receiver win for a short stretch on my terms. I plotted a modest arc toward the spot it offered, keeping my shoulders squared so the body would remember what straight is, while the tool tried to teach me a curve. As I moved, the salar unrolled a low note like a bow on glass, the tone it favors when heat is an idea rather than a fact. The note grew a hair brighter as I humored the arrow, then sank back when I adjusted to the needle. I stopped in a seam and pressed a glove against the plate beside it. The surface felt almost oily despite its dryness, a trick salts sometimes play when films wake under a skin. I turned the core tube gently into the seam, listening for the point where the crust's confidence thins. The plug came up with a faint sheen and a smell that had no natural home here. Warmed paper again, the breath of an office machine in a closed room. Under that familiar wrongness, there was a new thread, a tinny sweetness like the air around a small battery pulled from its wrapper. I wrote the pairing as cleanly as I could. Paper and metal, repeats near instrument insistence. The radio chose that moment to wake on its own, not with speech, but with that light double tap, the kind of sound you hear at a desk when someone sends a polite message and waits. I thumbed the talk key and kept my voice as plain as salt. Field to base. Waypoints adjusted overnight without my instruction. Sky and compass deny the adjustment. Instrument urges toward kiln patch bias. Odor anomaly repeats with metallic thread. Salt tone tracks instrument preference. requesting confirmation of any remote work on constellation or receiver table. The reply took long enough that I set the radio down and did a heel test while I waited, rocking weight to feel for hidden damp. When the voice returned, it sounded pasted together from phrases meant for reports. No known remote changes to your unit. Minor updates to the broader service expected this week. Nothing that should affect field stability in clear conditions. Proceed with caution. Log odors and acoustic observations. You may privilege celestial and magnetic for corridor purposes at your discretion. The cadence said permission. The space between words said, please keep believing in us. I said a new experiment because routine is the only way to talk to a place like this without starting a fight. I would walk a long, straight leg by the sky into terrain the instrument wished for, and let it draw the story it wanted. Then I would turn out of that story by the needle and see how loudly the salar objected. The first leg carried me over familiar pains into a fresh field where the plates darkened as if they had sunned themselves more honestly. The tug I had felt yesterday returned as soon as the boots settled there. Not magnetic, not wind, but a suggestion under the ankles that weight ought to choose a line already worn. The receiver's path straightened in approval and nestled almost sweetly into my walked line. For a little while, we lived as colleagues again. Then a seam ahead showed a behavior I had not yet seen. Its inner ink, the thin dark that marks where salt has settled and cracked, drew itself forward a finger's width as I approached, then paused. When I stepped over, the ink slid back into place after me with a quiet relief, like a drawer closed in a careful house. I tried it again. Approach, pause, step, slide. I told myself to swallow the story in that motion and drink only the fact, a late obedient line. Near midday, the light took its iron seat, and the field started to hum harder. The kiln patch thickened its pull until it felt like walking across a slow river of cold air. The receiver stayed impeccably pleased. I let it be pleased and began to feel the cost in the legs and the tank. Turning out of that patch became work. The body grows used to a groove quickly, and when you ask it to leave the groove, the ankles send their quiet objections, and the knees confer with the old scars, and the thirst nudges your mouth. I took the compass in both hands, as if that would shame my balance into honoring it. The needle held its patient rule. I turned away from the instrument's comfort into whiter plates and thinner song. The sound underfoot shrugged lower, as though I had walked out of a choir practice where I was not welcome. In the silence that replaced it, the radio made a single private click, then regretted it. The bosalt tooth had been living to the north of my plan all morning, fattening and thinning by the hour's moods. But now, it started to behave like a thing seen across heat should behave. It wavered honestly. That honesty gave me courage. I used the hat brim to shade the compass face and walked along a thread the stars had sown before dawn. Within a handful of breaths, the receiver began to disagree again, first with civility, then with hurt dignity. Its arrow twitched and tried a polite cough to remind me where the new waypoints waited. I denied them and kept my cadence slow and even, counting breaths to keep the body true. The salar seams along this leg had picked up yesterday's habit of accompanying me with a slight lag, ink deciding after I did. In that delayed companionship, I began to hear the faintest additional texture, a higher whisper braided into the lower hum, like carbon paper being peeled afloat. Each time the radio's relay ticked, that higher whisper leaned toward the instrument's wish, as if taking instruction. I decided to make the cost meaningful. I cut a deliberate dogleg, turning my back on the kiln patch and walking my way out of the tug's reach, even though the legs argued. A navigator's pride is a poor reason to waste water, and I felt the waste as I made the turn. But a truer reason sat under it. If the ground was learning my line and the instrument was learning the ground, I needed to step somewhere neither had yet practiced. I crossed into a zone where the plates wore a powdery bloom, a frost of crystals that broke under the boot in polite sighs. The salt sang there in a finer register. Not the glass rim, but something more papery, a sound that made the tongue dry. The warmed paper odor came once, over-true, and then gone. The metallic thread followed and lingered just at the edge of thought. I stopped and took a core from the seam that seemed least inclined to bear my curiosity. The plug rose reluctant, and for a breath I saw a hairline of brine hold its shape before collapsing. The tube felt cool in the glove, despite the sun's tough stare. I wiped it on cloth that smelled of cleaner from a place with floors and windows. When I raised my head from that small surgery, the receiver offered a message it had not offered before. A soft prompt asked whether I wished to accept updated reference points. It did not say who was offering. The phrasing carried the assurance of a process designed for comfort in a city, not for a person standing alone on a salar that had begun to repeat them back, a breath late. I closed the message without answering. The arrow went on pointing with a kind of patience that felt like someone on the other end had told it to be kind. I gave the radio a short truth. Field to base. Unit proposes updated reference points without request. Denies origin. Continuing with celestial and magnetic. Expect slower progress. Water and body within planned margins. Audible environment steady. Seam lag persists. Kiln pull measurable underfoot. No reply came right away. The relay made its 2 polite taps, as if to apologize for the silence. By late light, I had moved beyond both the kiln's confidence and the instrument's favorite curve. The basalt tooth looked honest and a little tired. I set a last small flag in a seam that had done nothing to earn suspicion, and wrote the day's ledger slow to keep the hand from editing the mind. Waypoints relocate while I sleep. They are not wandering, they are being told where to live. Receiver solicits consent as if to make a contract after the fact. Sky and iron keep faith. Salt sings louder when I let the beeps be right, softer when I do not. Seams behave as if they listen and then answer, one breath late. Odor repeats near radio intention. Metallic ghost lingers. Kiln field lays a groove, and the body wants the groove. I ended with a line I had avoided giving letters to. If I accepted the instrument's polite offer, the corridor I have been sent to verify would shrine itself in a place the ground prefers me to walk without saying why. If I refuse, I will keep paying out water to hold a line. The sky insists is correct while the salar, a patient clerk, learns my steps and arranges its files to match. When dark came, the wind returned with a schedule it seemed to have learned. I built a small wall of salt blocks to quiet a rattle and lay back with the receiver clipped low where it could not make the tent glow. The radio stayed shy and then, very late, made the light rhythm of 2 taps and a longer pause, a cadence I had come to think of as someone in another room considering a new memo. The crust beneath me held its breath and then gave it back. I told myself that in the morning, I would walk to a waypoint the receiver had moved during the night, and I would stand at the place the stars named and look down. If the tool chose not to meet me there again, I would accept its invitation for a short distance and ask it to show me what lies at the end of its kindness. I woke before the cold had finished its last work and let the tent stay dark while the sky picked out the stronger lamps. The receiver sat face down beside my head like a sulking child. The compass lay on my chest, feeling the world settle around its needle. I breathed evenly until my ribs remembered the pace I use when I want to hold a line through long flats. When I unrolled and stepped out, the wind had already quit for the morning. The crust underfoot welcomed weight the way it only does before the sun makes everything noisy. I set the hat back to give my eyes the sky and turned the receiver on without looking at it. I did not want its idea of where I was to crowd the points I intended to follow. The stars did what stars do when you have bothered to learn their habits. They drew a clean geometry from the basalt tooth to a corner I could not see, and then they added a kindness. They held still. I walked by that stillness. The compass rode my thumb and settled without argument. My boots placed themselves not on a track, but on a thought, and the thought belonged to the sky. The salar at night feels less like a field and more like a floor. It does not pretend depth or offer practice. It simply sits as itself and accepts your agreement. The only sound was the gentle crisp of crystals surrendering at the seams when a boot crossed. With each seam I counted a breath and let it go before taking the next step. A small vow to keep the heart steady, even if the mind balked later. I passed, at cautious intervals, the faint hieroglyphs of my own days-old prints, and each time I did, the crust offered a quiet correction, as if it wished me to admire how neatly it had polished them. I did not stop to admire. I carried the core tube in the crook of the arm and the water against the back, and the sense that I was sliding under a rule while it slept. By the time a pale scrim showed in the east, the receiver had decided it wanted to be heard. It tapped my wrist with the haptic it uses when it believes it has recovered from someone else's mistake. I looked then, because pride is a poor navigator. The waypoints had performed their small night work again. They lived now a touch farther along the course that led toward the kiln field and its runnels of tug. The instrument offered the same soft question about accepting updated reference chains, dressed in language meant to calm someone in a city elevator. I closed it without replying. I pressed the compass to my knee and set the needle along a line the brighter stars still named. I wrote one sentence in the notebook for the morning entry, because a sentence can hold more doubt than an argument. Stars hold, beeps solicit. I took the day's first core because I needed the crust to tell me whether it was listening. The seam I chose had thickened quietly in the night. The tube turned with a softness that made me feel it in the wrist bones. The plug lifted clean, surfaces bright and tight, a skin below that kept its secret without giving. Just the suggestion of damp, the way a closed mouth suggests a word. I held the tube to my cheek and felt a cool that did not belong to the hour. The familiar warmed paper note brushed the nose, then retreated like a clerk behind a door. The metallic thread lingered almost pleasantly, which was wrong in a way my training did not have language for. I capped the sample and lashed the tube again. All of it went into the book, with the steady hand of someone filing things they might soon need in a room with worse light. The first true test of the day came with the sun. Not at its violent height, but at the first moment it knew it would win. The salar song began, low to begin with, a rim scratch that announced itself like a throat cleared in a library. With the song came the renewed desire of the receiver to steer me with kindness. The arrow gestured toward the fresh waypoints as a host might point, palm open, toward a seat already chosen for you. Orders were patient in my pocket, crossed the white by the corridor drawn on a desk. Confirm, report. Field reality had made its counteroffer. Walk by the stars and the needle, and let the ground explain itself by absence and delay. I gave neither full victory. I would exit by the sky, but I would allow the instrument a short leading line whenever it requested it in the language of song and scent. So, I drew a compromise that cost. I set a bearing by the points I trust and walked it in long, unhurried breaths. After enough distance that the legs began to feel the heat's plan for them, I allowed the receiver to have a sliver of influence, a courteous bend that would not be obvious to a satellite, but would be written in my ankles. Each time I did, the ground brightened its tone a shade, the way a choir lifts when a director raises two fingers. Each time I took the bend back, the tone settled as if disappointed in practicing restraint. With the bend came the odor, faint and patient and wrong, warmed paper with the battery's sweetness braided, both smells arriving when the radio relay clicked twice and then behaved. I recorded it all with the short sentences of someone who has decided to be a clerk, if that is what the day requires. My second test was harder to justify to the part of me that reads memos. I chose a seam that had followed me obediently the day before, the kind with an inner line that slides a little after the boot has passed. I stood with one boot on the pane and one boot on the seam and waited until the song steadied. Then I might tilt it a shoulder toward the receiver's wish without moving my feet. The seam's inner ink responded a breath later, slanting toward the shoulder, as if gravity had been charmed sideways. I told myself the experiment meant nothing. Then I did it again and got the same mild disobedience of the ordinary. I wrote it plain because plain writing is how you keep panic out of a page. Seam obeys suggestion late. Alignment follows intent, not step. Water cost me for that patience. The bladder lightened in a way that made the mouth think about stingy sips. And when the sun climbed higher, I felt the hat's brim pass from comfort to requirement. I considered the corridor and the rock, and the fact that an exit is only clean if you can stand up at the far edge with enough clarity in your head to write, to radio, to choose the next day. To choose wrong in a salar is to be eaten by arithmetic you cannot smell. I compromised again, and the compromise was this. Walk by stars until the receiver sulks. Give it a modest victory. Walk by iron until the song settles. Repeat without confessing to either that they are sharing custody. Mid-morning granted me a breadcrumb I had not asked for. I came upon a cluster of older steps that were not mine, the same patient spacing I had noticed days before, a person of a kind weight with the gait of someone who knows flats and trust, walking beside me in a run that should have cross-hatched and did not. The edges of those steps should have softened, yet they stood a little sharper than my own fresh marks. I knelt and pressed a finger into one, and the crust declined my curiosity. The receiver, in that moment, chimed a cheerful note, the one it gives when everything aligns. I brought its crosshair to the print and watched it declare this a waypoint 1. The print was both there and not. The device was both right and wrong. I stood and breathed the air that smelled like light on paper and like a pocket battery pretending to be clean. The radio offered a double tap, as if to punctuate a thought it would not share. I kept my mouth off the talk key. There are moments when sending a report feels like teaching a rumor to the office. The kiln patch drew near along a shallow curve of darker plates, and with it, came the old tug under the ankles, a felt groove that invited me to accept a path my body did not choose. I allowed it briefly to save the legs, and then turned out of it again with more care than pride, because the world had learned enough of me now that any sharp change in habit sent little notices across the field. As I turned, the seam lag played its trick again, ink catching up after I passed, like a clerk following with a pen to make sure the record matched the act. I had the sense of being accompanied by the world's minute attention, not by a watcher with eyes, which would have been easier to refuse, but by the place's own appetite for arrangement. I aimed for a soft exit off the salar's open plate and toward a paler belt that promised a gravel tongue and a little honest ground to let the mind finish without the salt's grammar editing each step. The stars were gone by then, but the line they had sown before dawn remained in the body. I held it with the compass, one breath at a time. The receiver's screen sat dim at my belt, and in its dimness the waypoints drifted again with the grace of pins nudged by agreeable hands. The little message about accepting references grew more patient, less insistent, as if whoever was asking had learned my refusal and was choosing manners as their new instrument. I did not accept. I let the arrow point and be disappointed. When the first true gravel appeared under the chalk of salt, the song fell away with a relief I felt in the throat. I stepped up onto that coarser world, and the body adjusted back to a physics it prefers. My last act on the white was to take a core from a seam at the boundary. The tube turned and rose with a soft, sticky noise like tape lifted and laid again. The smell of warmed paper came up, plain and unapologetic, and the metallic sweetness sharpened into something that made the teeth ache a little. I capped it and stood with the basalt tooth off my left shoulder and a low bench of badland ahead. The radio clicked twice and then put a wordless hush over the idea of speaking. I gave the office a measured truth anyway. Field to base, exiting main plate by celestial and magnetic guidance. Corridor reel on ground only when instrument is honored. Ground repeat steps after delay. Odors repeat tied to receiver intention. Costs paid in water and time, within margins. Expect mapping notes and samples. The reply came later with the weight of calm. Copy exit. Proceed to bench. Rest. Consider re-entry at Twilight to compare star guidance after adjustments settle. It was an odd way to talk about adjustments that were not mine. I ate a measured handful and drank with the caution the hour demanded. I sat with my back to stone that did not sing and felt the legs remember their true height. The receiver on my belt made one last polite prompt, as if it had learned how to ask without being a nuisance. Accept updated points? I closed it and tucked the device into the hat for shade. The hat smelled like sweat and salt and the kind of cloth that remembers being folded. The wind picked up its clerk's schedule again and moved a corner of the world, just enough to show me the thin silver of the salar in the middle distance, unmoved by my hours upon it, and perhaps more itself for having watched me try to letter it. When the sun bent toward the late, I stood and weighed my choices. Re-enter by stars and test whether the night now teaches the same lesson as the morning, or make the longer land loop along gravel and return to the island from another angle, bringing the receiver through a place where its favorite groove cannot argue. Orders ask for a corridor verified. The ground asks for a listener who can leave when listening becomes imitation. I cleaned the tube and packed the flags and folded the notebook shut on a page that would crust if the wind got in. I told myself the line I did not want to hear. The exit is not the end. Leaving taught me how the white speaks when it thinks I am going. Returning will teach me who it thinks it should keep. I stepped off the gravel back onto a small tongue of salt to see if it would welcome a heel now that I had broken the conversation. It accepted the weight with the tolerant patience of a clerk who knows you will be back with more questions. The song rose just enough to be heard, no more. The radio said nothing. The compass kept its quiet rule. I tipped the hat to the sky that had carried me and to the arrow that wanted me elsewhere, and promised both an answer at Twilight. Twilight gave me a better bargain than day ever does. The light flattened until the salar was neither mirror nor floor, just a wide, exact quiet with edges. I let the island sit behind me and walked back toward the white with the receiver shut and the compass warm against my palm. The sky kept a few bright points for me, like a teacher who knows which students will actually show. I took the same slow breaths I had trained into the ribs across years of flats. The salt under my boots felt considerate, the plates cool and tight, seams speaking in little paper size when crossed. I wanted answers that would not collapse under sun. If the ground had learned me, I would ask it to speak now, when everything else rests. I stepped onto a pale pane that had held its dignity through heat and wind, then chose a seam with a modest undercut and set the core tube. The twist came smooth as ribbon. The plug rose with a soft, tacky sound like tape lifted from a tabletop. I did not lift it clear. I held the tube in place, half-turned, and pressed my other hand flat to the crust beside it. The brine gathered under the skin of salt and shifted, a slow, cold thought moving toward my warmth. In the glove I felt a faint pulse that was not my own. I finished the turn and brought up the plug. The air around it wore the now familiar warmed paper note, and under that the metallic ghost sweetened. A taste the tongue noticed before the nose did. The tube was colder than the evening deserved, as if it had been kept in shade within the earth. I wrote none of that right away. I let the hand be honest first. The receiver, face dark at my belt, woke itself with a quiet confidence and nudged my wrist. Its little heart loves schedules. Twilight pleases it. I turned it on and watched its patient map redraw with new kindness. The waypoints had made their short nightly stroll again, not random but careful, each placed just far enough to make a person say fine. The instrument offered the same polite prompt about adopting references. I dismissed it and set the crosshair over the spot where my palm had felt the brine speak up under the crust. The device placed that spot a fraction to the west of where my eyes and the compass wanted it. When I shifted to humor the arrow, the cold under the plate moved again, as if something beneath had accepted the invitation before I finished giving it. I laid the tube down and spread the hand wider. A slow run of chill answered, not a flow like water under pressure, more like a thought passing along a long desk where clerks nod in sequence. I told myself to be careful with meaning. The fact was the only safe thing. Underfoot, a delay. Beneath the delay, a movement. Near the movement, the instrument's satisfaction. I built a grid with my body because paper still outruns mystery when you let it. Step forward. 3 of my own easy paces. No, I corrected myself. Step forward some paces because digits belong in screens and not in the head when night is thin. Stop, kneel, hand to crust, listen with the palm. Then step at a right angle, the same distance by breath, and repeat. The grid was small enough that I could feel the whole of it without losing the thread of the sky. At one corner, the brine under the crust answered the hand quickly, a little shiver of cold and a fattening of the seam's faint ink line. At the next corner, the answer took its patient time, arriving only after I had told myself to quit expecting it. At the third corner, there was no answer at all, until the receiver gave a soft haptic sigh, and the arrow suggested a correction. Then the cold slid in like a book pushed across a table. At the fourth, nothing moved, and in that honesty I felt relief cut with fear. I wrote the corners in the notebook with plain talk. Fast, late, prompted, mute. The page looked like a clerk's tally. Good! I needed a clerk more than a poet. The salt began its night song more quietly than by day, a thin rim keening that lives farther back in the ears. I made my next test cruel, because kindness had gotten me only delays. I stood with one boot on a seam and the other on a pane, pressed my palm near the heel on the seam, and clicked the radio on without speaking. The relay woke like a small insect. On the second tap that always comes when metal remembers itself, the cooled brine under my hand slid. The seam's dark line followed with a late, delicate tuck, as if not to crease the page. I clicked off and waited. The cold withdrew after, not during, during, the radio's small monologue. I did it again and got the same like-for-like, relay, response, silence, soften. I told myself to resist the idea that the ground was listening to a tool. The safer idea was worse. Perhaps the tools in the ground were listening to the same thing, and I had not learned its name. Orders lay quiet in my pocket, but the moral weight of them pressed against the ribs. They had asked me to carry a corridor across this white for other people's loads and days. The device those people favored kept inviting me along a groove the salar had learned to like. And the ground's body language, its seams, its softened prints, its patience with my weight, suggested it would help me if I accepted. The sky and the needle had never cared whether they were obeyed. They only stated. I caught myself wanting to trust what wanted me. That is not a scientific impulse. It is a human one born from hours alone with a speaking field. I wrote it down anyway because truth, even the shabby kind, is worth its line. I walked a long leg by the sky, letting the bright points hold their simple geometry a while longer before dawn erased the whole chalkboard. The receiver kept pace for a bit, then began its friendly steering again. Each time I humored the arrow, the ground brightened its tone, and the cold under the crust seemed quicker to gather. Each time I returned to the points and the iron, the song lowered and the cold grew coy. I asked myself what a clerk would see. On a desk, this would be labeled correlation and sent back for more careful thought. In the body, it felt like being led down a hallway by someone closing doors ahead of you and opening others the moment you seem willing to enter. Past midnight, the wind gave a thin brush across the plate and then stopped, as if changing pages. I came upon my own prints from the afternoon exit and found them edited yet again, edges trimmed beyond what such brief hours should allow. Alongside them, the other set I had found earlier, patient stride, familiar weight, showed fresh decisions. Those steps had been straight and sure before. Now they glanced toward the kiln field and then away, as if the owner had listened to a suggestion and refused it, gently but finally. The receiver chimed an attitude I knew: cheer when it believes I have done the sensible thing. It thought that refusal was a win. I touched one of those strangers' heels with a glove, and the crust pushed back with a firmness I could not explain by air or time. In the nose, the warmed paper scent rose and withdrew. The metallic sweetness held on an extra heartbeat, as if whoever was working late had left a battery on the copier to claim a seat. I chose a hard thing next. I walked into a shallow low where thin films pool under the skin at night. The crust over such a place will carry a person who treats it like glass and will punish a heel dropped without care. I went slow enough to let the salt complain, slow enough that the brine beneath had time to decide whether it would accept me. It did. With reluctance, I felt through the boot, like a counter clerk sliding a form across without looking up. In that low, the song settled into a single pitch that matched the receiver's most contented purr. I stopped and stood there so long the hat brim cooled. The radio made its 2 taps and then a third I had not heard before, a little afterthought that made me think of a pencil laid down next to a stack of papers. Underfoot, the cold gathered fast and sure, no delay. I whispered the observation into the device as if the stars might object to voice. Field note: brine answers without lag in low. Radio cadence adds a tail. Instrument reports alignment at ease. Odors near present. I did not send it. I kept it for the morning feed, when voices sound less like secrets. When the east paled for good, I turned back toward the island to bank what I had learned before heat could rewrite it. The salar carried me without complaint. The points in the sky did their last work and then went. I made one last grid, smaller than the first, near a seam that had behaved like a quiet witness all night. Hand, wait, answer, hand, wait long, answer, hand, radio, tick, answer at once. The pattern held, tidy enough that a manager would approve it on a slide. That thought frightened me more than anything the place had said. If the ground could be made to give such cooperation, then the desk would decide the corridor was true, and my doubts would become notes attached to a report nobody reads twice. Back at the island's low wall, I set the receiver on a flat stone and turned it face up to the paling sky. It chirped with a morning's pride. It proposed its references once more, with the soft politeness of a waiter who has learned your name. I left it open and wrote the ledger with the spare vocabulary I keep for days, when too many good stories tempt the hand. Brine underfoot answers after pause, answers faster near instrument intent and radio breath, answers without delay in night lows, seams tuck late in the direction of suggestion. Prints lift their edges since I began walking. Stranger's track declines the kiln's pull. Waypoints continue to accept nudges from a hand I cannot see. Sky and iron hold, they do not flatter. I added a line that tasted like a confession. The corridor will be truest on paper if I accept the beeps, and truest on ground if I refuse them. Both assertions can be written clean. Only one keeps a traveler honest when the map is away in a pocket and the salt wants company. The sun broke clean over the distant badland and promised its usual interrogation. I put away the night's witnesses, pulled the brim low for the day's work, and packed water with the resentment of a person who knows the cost of each swallow. Then I picked up the receiver and, for the first time since it began to ask, I let my thumb hover over the soft word that would accept its new references. I did not press. I held the breath so long my chest argued. I lowered the thumb and shut the question. Not today. First, I would walk one more leg by stars that were already gone, and see whether the world remembered them without looking. Dawn had not finished rinsing the stars when I stood at the island wall, with the receiver open on a stone, the compass warm in my palm, the tube lashed at my side, and the hat willing to be a roof again. The night had taught its restrained lesson. The ground answered after a pause. It answered faster when the receiver wanted it to, and fastest when the radio breathed. In the shallow low, it answered without delay at all. The seams tucked themselves a heartbeat late, in whatever direction I seemed ready to believe. The waypoints kept waking to new addresses written by a hand I could not see. The sky and the iron held their old truth and asked for nothing. A corridor could be summoned on paper by accepting the beeps, and a corridor could be earned on ground by refusing them. Both would read well in a report. Only one would help a passerby who had to choose with thirst riding their tongue. I needed to close the ledger. I clipped the receiver to my belt and let it blink at the morning. It made its gentle offer as if it had learned courtesy from watching me. Accept updated references? The word meant permission, but everything about the depth under the salt told me it also meant custody. I palmed the compass and set a bearing the sky had sown hours earlier, though the lamps were gone. Then I asked for an answer I could live with. I would walk this last leg by the points in the needle until the instrument sulked. Then I would stop and test the ground with the tube in my hand, and the old trick the radio had become by accident. If the brine gathered without help, the corridor lived where the stars believed. If it gathered only when the receiver or the relay asked, the path belonged to equipment and offices and not to travelers. The salar accepted me with the humble textures of early day. The plates were cool and tight. The seams sighed in paper voices where a boot crossed them. I counted breath with step to keep the body's metronome on and the fear out. The island shrank behind me until it was only a sentence the mind could finish. The basalt tooth sat honest ahead, and a little to my right, fattening and thinning with heat, as it always had and always would. The receiver decided to be helpful, and rode my line for a while. It has a good bedside manner when it thinks cooperation saves a quarrel. I stopped at a seam that had behaved like a clerk all week, and knelt. The tube turned with the soft tack that means films are waking. I pressed the palm beside the bore, and held my breath as if silence could convince brine to speak faster. A cool gathered under the skin of salt and slid toward my hand, slow to begin with and then sure. I did not look at the receiver. I clicked the radio on and let its relay do its light hallways music. The cold did not change its mind for that song. I clicked off. The seam's dark line tucked a shade after my hand left it, late and polite as ever. I wrote the first plain truth of the morning in a line my mentor would approve. Here the ground answers without help. I walked again, and the instrument began its friendly steering. It wanted me toward the kiln patch and its runnels of tug. Each time I ignored it, the salar song settled to that low glass note that lets the brain become a tool and not a fire. Each time I humored the arrow a step or two, the tone brightened, and a faint sweetness rose in the nose, that warmed paper breath braided with a battery's ghost. I added those instances to the book, without drawing conclusions, because conclusions, unlike corridors, are easy to drag to the wrong place. The cost came in the old currency. Water left the bladder faster than my optimism liked. Heat climbed onto the hat and stayed. Ankles argued when I asked them to leave the shallow groove the ground reminded them to love. I paid and kept the cadence small and true. Half a morning in, the receiver offered a jaunty chirp and declared a waypoint 1. I checked and found I was standing where the sky and the iron said nothing special at all. I smiled without joy and took a core right there to patronize my own pettiness. The plug rose clean, the air around it ordinary. No quickening cold, no eager tuck. On the instrument's map, an invisible corridor had been pleased. On the ground, the desert remained a room that did not take meetings without notice. I felt the moral weight of orders then, hotter than the sun. A line drawn on a desk keeps trucks from breaking ankles and time from wasting itself. Refusing that line because the salt likes to answer late felt like defiance disguised as piety. Accepting it felt like telling anyone who followed to listen to the polite voice in their belt and not to the floor under their bones. The right choice did not exist. Only the honest one did, and honesty is a poor bridge until you've fallen off the first fancy one. I turned to face the kiln field a final time, walked into its slow tug until the ankles began to adopt the groove, and then set my last experiment. I stood half in its dark plates and half in the paler plain. I laid the compass on the salt and watched the needle speak without drama. I set the receiver on the ground beside it, face up to a sky that service bureaus claim is theirs. I unhooked the radio and placed it between them, like a small referee. Then I stepped back, pressed my palm to a seam on the kiln side, and waited without closing my eyes or my thought. The cold gathered quickly under the kiln plates. The song brightened right away. On the plain side, nothing moved until the relay made its careful taps. Then a delayed chill slid under that hand too, smaller and late. The needle did not care. The basalt tooth sat where it had always sat, amused by my attention. I rose, tasted the metal in the back of the mouth, and let myself say out loud the partial answer I had been avoiding. The ground will serve a signal if you teach it. The signal will flatter a walk if you let it. Neither knows thirst, only I do. I packed the devices and gave the receiver its polite refusal once more. No to the new references. It did not insist. The prompt returned later with better manners, and I refused again. I let the compass ride my thumb. I set the hat for the long exit. The corridor I would deliver would live in two versions. One was the one the office wanted, so the logistics would get done, and I would keep my job. It would use the points that had learned to move at night, and it would come with clean plots and tidy samples and photographs of flags that obeyed a narrative. The other was the one I would write for anyone who carries their life in a bladder and a headlamp. It would say this: at Twilight and near the lows, the crust answers without a coach. In the kiln fields, the ground prefers compliance. Under radios and friendly beeps, the brine learns the same tricks people do. Bring the old skills, because one day the sky will be all you can afford, and the arrow will want too much. I did the last work quietly. I walked a deliberate line toward the island by the star's memory, and the compass's calm, even as day took control. I stopped once more to take a core at the edge of a field that had not spoken all week, and the tube came up with a coolness that felt like permission. No paper breath, no battery sweetness. I radioed a measured report with a tone that would not frighten a manager. Field to base, crossing complete, corridor verified on ground by celestial and magnetic. Instrument-based adjustment observed. Attached dual recommendations. Sample secured, resting before return. The reply came in the voice of someone reading, while others listened. Copy complete. Submit both sets. We appreciate rigor. The relay tapped once after that, as if a clerk had underlined a word. Back at the island wall, I laid out the notebook, the tube, the compass, and the receiver in a row, because order has a way of taking heat out of a room. I wrote my two maps on separate pages with the same careful hand. On one, I let the instrument's kindness perform its dance. The corridor sliding toward the kiln, the waypoints pleased, the seam lags in attendance like ushers. On the other, I let the sky and the iron draw their spare calligraphy, a line that wastes water and patience if you let yourself be hurried by drones and screens, a line that a person can hold in the throat when everything else talks too much. I capped the tube and stowed it. I folded both pages and slid them into different sleeves, one for a desk, one for a pocket that would one day save a stranger's boots. I put the receiver face down and the compass face up, and let them sit like that while I drank a careful swallow and listened for the salar's late answer. It came the way it always had here, a breath behind the moment. The plates under the wall offered a small, cool exhale, as if the field had finally filed the last of my steps and had turned the page. The seams near my boot tucked themselves a little in the direction I was already facing, not coaxing now, only acknowledging. The air around the stone smelled like nothing, and then like stone again. The relay did not tap. The arrow did not blink. The needle lay calm as a sleeping eye. I packed the tools, I set the hat. I began the walk back to the gravel tongue, and when the white finally released my heels, I did not look back because I wanted the final image to be the ground finding its own quiet again, as if it had been writing ahead of me the entire time and had simply waited for me to read the line it preferred.